Dario, it's been a while.
Yes, sir. Thanks for having me, Jason. Looking forward to this.
Absolutely. I'm always intrigued by your stuff because you're not afraid to question the status quo. You will experiment with stuff, you will say what you feel, and you always have a reason behind it. So I wanted to bring you on specifically to talk about femur rotation and kind of your journey. Spent like a couple months really focusing on sprint work, increase your sprinting, your top speed by 4 kilometers an hour over 2 months.
Hmm.
And I guess let's just start with what is femur? Like, how do you define femur rotation, just so we get an idea and a reference point of kind of what we're going to be talking about?
For sure. So before we start, I want to give a shout out to Adarian Bar. Basically, femur rotation is just femur extension. So femur extension is literally the femur rotating back in the hip sockets to create the extension. So when you're a toe off, the back leg, okay, that you're pushing off, that is basically the extended position of the femur. And how much range you got to rotate, that is your femur rotation. That is your hip extension range of motion. And the whole concept of femur rotation, was coined by Adarian Bar, is about increasing that range and that elite athletes have a more pronounced femur rotation and in most of the cases more range to work with as well. So they're essentially their thigh separation is bigger. Not always, but it just is a more pronounced rotation of the femur that pops them forward. And that's mostly due to their hamstrings working differently than in sub-elite populations.
It's funny, like I made a note before this, be like, these methods really remind me of a Darien bar. So
Yeah.
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 Um,
So just to add something like so the way I discovered this, like I was racing a super elite athlete and I looked at the video and he was smoking me, right? And I was looked at that video for like 50 times and I was just like seeing something like he was doing something differently than I was. And at like around the 40th, 45th time of looking at it, I got it. There was something different to his stride, right? When his foot hit the ground, it wasn't what he was doing in the air or how he was hitting the ground. It was everything from ground contact till push off. That was different about him. And I have seen Adarian post stuff about femur rotation and stuff, but like he never puts out any exercises. Like I also bought a lot of videos from his website for a lot of money, and he doesn't really teach it. And so that really made me experiment for like a month straight, just like experiment. Like I was basically wasting track sessions, wasting all my energy into trying to get my femur to extend more. Then at some point I figured it out. And in that one session where I figured it out, I hit a 3 kilometer per hour PR, just like that.
and you're like, this is it.
I was
Now,
like,
how do I
yeah,
keep doing this? Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So I took his I wouldn't even call it a concept because it's basic biomechanics, actually, if you think about it. But like Darian Barr is the guy that is the first guy actually to bring attention towards that biomechanical action of the femur. And I took it and I put it into an actual training system and like a systematic approach in to installing that in everybody you see or like optimizing the range that people have.
You made a post, or actually, like in one of your posts, and this is what kind of connected all the dots to me because, like, I've seen it, I've watched it, and I've heard a lot of his stuff about like related to like squatted running, and you have to stay slightly lower to create more force and all these different things. But kind of like you said, it is tough to put what he says and then apply it without knowing like exactly what you're trying to do and experimenting with stuff. And you wrote
Exactly.
your knee bend, you need to keep your knee bent until the thigh bone is behind the body. And that to me was like that is the ultimate cue that I was kind of looking for because it's funny, like I will when I'm sprinting, I feel my best when I'm at a like particular height almost, particularly like at max speed. Where if
Hmm.
I'm up too high and I'm focused on like just being totally upright for too long, I don't get the same push off the ground. But if I kind of squat a little bit too low, my foot contact is just a little bit too long on the ground. I need that fine line of where I can produce a ton of force, but I know exactly what you mean. Like when you feel it, you really feel like you've had that burst, right?
This is that it's a weird sensation. For like for elite athletes, all this stuff doesn't matter. They are running well, like it's called running well. It's like running efficiently. If you don't have it, which you just mentioned, keeping the knee bent until the femur is behind the body, that is the definition of delayed knee extension. You have to delay the extension of the knee until the hip is extended, and the hip is not extended when the femur is right underneath your hip, like in the end position of a hip thrust or a deadlift. It is when in running, it's when the femur is behind the body. So you need the muscles that are responsible for bending the knee to keep the knee bent until the femur is behind the body. It sounds simple, but applying it in actual exercise and during a sprint is the hard part. And that's exactly like where I was stuck for like a month, and I was just thinking about this constantly every single day. Like I was dreaming about it as well. Like I often have dreams about training interventions, and then I try it out, and most of the times it's trash. But yeah, so that hip height that you just mentioned, this is like the whole concept of squatted running, right? So constraint based learning in sprinting. So you basically expose your body to different ends of the spectrum of like a certain feature of running, and your body will self-organize, use that experience and see if there's something useful for it. And your body and your brain is smart enough to self-organize when you then let go of the constraint to use whatever it deems as useful for it. So with squatted running, basically you're exploring hip heights. So you could run super tall, you could run super low. And I like also to like to do like crescendos where you like start super high, go super, super low, go high again, and just explore. And then the athlete will feel where do I have the most pop? Where does it feel the best? And then after like 50, 60 meters or whatever, you just tell them to release it, boom, and just keep on running normally, and their body will self-organize. And that's the beauty about sprint constraints because you don't have to teach. You just let them run and they're going to be athletes.
I never heard that crescendo sprinting before. I really like that idea to allow them to figure it out because otherwise, I've had kids, and I think of like a couple in particular, where one of them was definitely like more acceleration based, but he would maintain like the squat for way too long. And like I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to give him all these different cues to get out of it because he just acceleration first 10 pretty good. After that, like just didn't pick up more speed like he should. Like it, and compared to like how strong he was, it just wasn't close to matching any other type of reference point that you could look
Mm-hmm.
at sprint wise. But that is interesting. I want to ask about the core positioning during this squatted running. So I know like even from like the Franz Bosch course, he is all about a neutral position. Now a lengthened neutral position, which I know you have talked about a little bit before, but the fear of if your femur rotates too long, you lose that neutral position of your pelvis, and it could be a lack of strength or maybe a lack of flexibility. But are you concerned about that? Are you teaching someone or almost coaching them like bring your femur back as far as you can without losing that position? Like what do you think about that?
Mm. So first we need to talk about this whole notion of neutral pelvis. I think this whole concept and what people talk about, and yeah, you gotta maintain a neutral pelvis and you can't spill the water out of the bowl in sprinting. I think that isn't really like that's what people think it is about the pelvis, but it's more about the relationship between the low back and the pelvis. It's more
Yes,
about lumbopelvic control. You don't want to
that's
be
exactly
all,
it.
yeah, you don't want to be all over the place with your lumbar spine and your pelvis. You don't want it like to be like jerking around and oscillating crazy because you don't have the control. Like that would be just like energy leaking. But you also don't want to be on the other spectrum where you freezing up everything. This is like what people who have strength trained a lot, straight up not so talented athletes do. They like completely freeze their pelvis and their lumbar spine, and they don't have any stride length at all. So think about a power lifter running.
Sure.
So I think the whole neutral pelvis isn't really something that you should chase. You should chase lumbopelvic control, and that is developed quite quickly. Like it's not a concept that requires a ton of drilling, and basically the solution is just running with a stick over your head in different with different other constraints, and people will pick it up quickly. So I had a talented 11-year-old soccer player, and his dad used to play German Bundesliga, so in the 80s and 90s. So
You don't have to call it soccer if you don't want to either.
yeah, I don't know. Since getting into strength and conditioning, football has become soccer to me because if I say
Yeah,
football,
yeah.
I think
Everyone
American.
refers to football as American football. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, so the kid is talented. He's pretty quick, fast for 11 years old. Super long legs, super crazy stride length, but he was all over the place with his pelvis and his lumbar spine. Like he was like super jiggly and wobbly around. And literally, I just let him do a stick overhead sprint and then let him do a squatted run with a stick overhead. And then I remeasured his speed and like literally from one set to the other, it went from 23 kilometers per hour to 26. He made a 3 kilometer per hour jump like that. And it wasn't because he was getting warmed up, because I had tested the speed the weeks before, and the highest he has ever hit was 23. So it's a motor learning concept. The whole neutral pelvis is the lumbopelvic control that you can pick up quite quickly. And when it then comes to hip extension cannot happen without anterior tilt. In sprinting, it's a oscillation and a so everybody talks in gait about, oh yeah, it's reciprocal motion. Why don't we apply that to sprinting? So if one leg is extending, you need space for the femur to rotate back. So if you have a posteriorly tilted pelvis or even neutral pelvis, then the ischial tuberosity, right down like the sit bone, will be in the way of your femur rotating further back. So in order to get the femur to rotate further back, the pelvis needs to tilt anteriorly to create this space, and then your femur can rotate further back. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we need anterior tilt for maximum hip extension. And I'm not saying you want to like absolutely completely maximize your hip extension so that you're jamming into the bone. That wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't have that elastic recall to get a quick hip flexion. Then it's like just a bandwidth that you want to get into, but you can expand that bandwidth. And same for the hip flexion. You need your pelvis to tilt posteriorly. So if this is your hip capsule, so for sorry for the people who are listening on Spotify, but if this is your
Go to
hip
YouTube.
capsule,
Yeah.
if this is your hip capsule and your femur wants to flex up, if your pelvis doesn't tilt posteriorly, you will get stuck here. So the swing leg, it needs to tilt posteriorly so that this can move up further. And it's that, and exactly, so the stance leg will be anteriorly, so the stance side of the pelvis needs to anteriorly tilt to allow for that femur rotation to happen, for the extension to happen, while the other side will slightly posterior tilt so that the hip flexion can happen. And that creates this reciprocal motion, and that creates the stride length and the running stride.
I always think that regardless of the athlete, if you record someone you watch them, and then you record them, and they made a big improvement of some kind, what they did isn't necessarily wrong, no matter what it was, right? Like if some people say you have to have a neutral position, if some people say, it doesn't really matter. What if someone gets faster, isn't that the ultimate goal, really?
Yeah, absolutely. But you then have to ask yourself, okay, did I make this person faster right now for 2, 3, 4 weeks by giving them something that will not help them get faster over the long term? So honestly, I
I
can't
think,
even, for
yeah, I
example,
think part of
overspeed
it too
sprints.
is, yeah, if like you said, if someone within the same day makes a huge jump of some kind, it's not like they got a half mile an hour faster over 4 weeks of training because of just exposure to it, right? Like they made some sort of mechanical change to what they were doing.
Could be a reason, yeah. It could be a reason. So either you improve your technique, which opened up more, which opened up better leverage to run. Like, for example, a huge improvement in hip extension will give you more, it will give you better leverage to push off, and it will allow for a larger range of acceleration. So if you have more hip extension, you can produce power over a larger range. Now, if that doesn't come with a faster weight shift and a faster roll through the foot, then you might be limiting your contact time. So certainly not saying here that you should start to push crazy and increase your contact times, because that will not make you faster. But to your question, the question is, can you improve someone over the long term? Did you just squeeze out more neurological output by, for example, like imposing a super intense stimulus like overspeed sprints? You can't milk that forever. So you're going to have to make technical changes at some point to allow for more potential to build output on. So I think if you make some technical change and it results in an instant improvement in speed, then that's awesome. If you see an improvement over multiple weeks, then it's probably because of improved relaxation, improved output, quicker ground contact time, whatever kinetic measurement you want to take.
How much rotation is too much? Is that all based off of then the frequency of the stride as well? Like if someone extends too far front to back, say
Mm-hmm.
separation between their knees, is it just determined based off of like, all right, now they've lost a little bit of control, say, and their frequency has gone down, so now we got to bring that back a little bit.
Yeah. So obviously you
I
have
know this
to,
is like an individual basis too,
yeah.
like when you're
So
watching someone.
if you, like, you never want to force anything. Like with this whole femur rotation stuff, you don't want to apply this stuff, try to improve their hip extension, and then tell them, oh, I need more range. I need more range. All you're gonna do is maybe open up some movement options, open up some relative motion between the femur and the acetabulum, and then you're gonna let them run with different constraints where they can feel the femur rotation. And like I said, allow their body to take whatever it deems useful. So if they're not going to use more range, then they're not going to use more range. I'm not going to hammer on it. I'm not telling the person that I need more range when I'm training them. Like if they ask a question, sure, I'm going to answer it, but
Yeah.
I'm not going to video it and so after like enhancing the range and then letting him sprint and then filming it, I'm not going to be like, "Oh, you didn't improve your range. We need you to push more or whatever." I will make sure that the basics of sprinting are still maintained. So I'm not
Hmm.
gonna try to improve range at the cost of ground contact time, at the cost of relaxation, at the cost of how you're interacting with the floor. And yeah, those are basically the main points, especially ground contact time.
Now, when you were sprinting yourself, did you do all your reps at, say, 100% effort? I shouldn't even say effort, 100% top speed, where you're taking a long break in between and looking at it that way? Or were you like, all right, at 90% effort, I'm going to try this. 90% effort, I'm going to try this. And then maybe this. And you look at all of those times. And then if they improve, then all right, let's crank our speed up a little bit more. Try those same things again. Like, I guess I'm always fascinated by when someone is experimenting on themselves. And I love when coaches do this, their process of figuring something out.
Um, so the way I was doing it is I increased my range in the femur rotation with some specific drills, and then I try to feel the increased femur rotation in squatted runs, and those are over a longer distance, so anything between 50 and 80 meters, and those would be submaximal. And if I can feel it, once I feel it, maybe the last 10 meters, I go 100%.
What is sub max for that? Like, are you talking like
70, 80,
oh
90%,
okay, yeah. I'm just
95.
curious to get a gauge, yeah.
Mm, somewhere around in that range. And I would only speed it up if I'm feeling it well. So I would always video it, look at it afterwards, see, okay, this constraint did this to me, focusing on this, did this to my kinematics. And then like after a couple sprints, when I was feeling really warm and I was saying, okay, I feel good today. Um, the the video looks a little bit different, looks better. And I would just film it. Then I would put up my timing system and run flight tens and see what happens. So sometimes it will be it would never be a worse time. That is the thing. It would never be a
Yeah.
worse time. I would never drop below my previous personal best. It would always be somewhere around the same, and I would be like, okay, this didn't do anything. This wasn't it. And at some point, it just clicked, and boom, made a 3 kilometer per hour jump, and then I was stuck at that for like 7 weeks. And I was always my workouts would always be like a lot of long sprints, somewhere in the 90% range, or just a couple fly tens. So all upright running, and at some point, I would just hit a new PR.
Very nice. Um, I know you made a post one time about a mistake with sprinting is going from a short to long approach. And I think a
I
lot of
wouldn't call it a
coaches,
mistake.
what do you say?
It's not a mistake. It's
Okay.
just, well, continue with your question.
Um, but and it was because you want to build max velocity qualities first, is what you had mentioned in the post. Is basically don't totally count out max velocity qualities by just doing short speed work only. And then like a month later, you end up like getting to finally max speed work. Um, your point was like continue to improve those along the way. Um, and I guess a lot of people do take that short to long approach. I guess how do you start addressing max speed work without worrying about hamstring issues? Because I know for me, if I have kids come in for the summer, if if I don't start them at like 10 to 20 yards for like at least a couple weeks, I have some tight like hamstrings where to the point where they're like, you know what? I don't know if I should like sprint today.
Hmm. So I definitely have to give a little bit more context for that one post. So that I didn't say that short to long is wrong. I use short to long. It's great. It's for specific people. It's absolutely the way to go. and I use it with most of my athletes, short to long. I'm just saying, if you want to take an athlete who hasn't been sprinting and want to turn him into a sprinter, like I'm doing right with myself right now, then you have to do a long to short. Because if you take a basketball player who now wants to sprint a lot and wants to get faster, then it would be a smart idea to know where you are going to. So if you don't have a max velocity technique set, you don't know what exactly you are trying to get to with your acceleration, then you're just going to work on the acceleration that you have available right now. If you build a new, not necessarily new, but like a more suited max velocity pattern over a longer period of time, then you know exactly what your acceleration wants to prepare you for. So then your acceleration work later down the line can be more intentful for what you are trying to do, because races are won in max velocity. So that is just for like if you're trying to build a sprinter out of nothing. And that's how I would go about it with a track athlete as well. I would get their max velocity first before I try to teach them the acceleration that goes with that max velocity that they have. Short to long is great. I use short to long with most of my athletes. The only time, so short to long mainly for like field players, field field athletes. Short to long is, in my opinion, most of the times better because they are getting a lot of upright running already in their sport. And with basketball players, for example, I think long to short is better because they are if basketball players live in the gym in the off season, so they are getting tons of accelerations and decelerations, and
Sure, yeah.
that's why you need to prepare them early on for that upright running stimulus with lower intensity, a little bit longer sprints. And in terms of hamstring injuries, I I don't know. Maybe I'm doing something wrong, but I don't really think too much about hamstring injuries. I think about, okay, how can I just not fuck up the sprint
Yeah.
progression? How can I not fry them early on? And how can I develop a running pattern that is not prone to hamstring injuries? So that's where that lumbopelvic control comes into play. That's where learning how to use your hamstrings properly in a sprint comes into play. That's where a nice reciprocal motion of the pelvis comes into play, because if you are not getting that clean hip flexion and a well sequenced unfolding of your shank of your lower leg after the hip flexion has happened, that's where the hamstring injuries happen, right? So if you make sure it is an efficient pattern, and if you work on technique and they get faster, most likely you are making them more efficient, then you don't really have to worry about hamstring injuries. Now, if someone had injuries in the past, I will look at stuff, but I would still try to instill my running technique philosophy on them, and I don't force people into techniques. I literally just let them run with constraints and they're going to build their technique themselves. I've never told an athlete anything about how they're supposed to run. Never in my life.
A couple makes me kind of think of two different podcasts. One recently I had with Matt McKinnis Watson, where he was talking about using, and you could apply it to any sprint drill you wanted to, but using sprint drill work as a way to develop capacity. So like
Mhm.
even early on, you want to build some like upright techniques, you could, like you said, run with a stick over your head or something like that and do tons of drill work with that. That will help their capacity when they're doing more volume of higher level sprint work. And then a recent podcast, it was actually the last podcast I did with Sam Portland, where he was talking about he helped someone who was like coming back from a specifically a hamstring injury, and they never sprinted over 90%, and he ended up like PRing after 8 weeks. But what he did was like you sprint to 20 yards, whatever your, let's say you're like 10 to 20 yards split, you match that split for another 20 yards. So you might hit like 80, 90-ish% of your top speed, but you're holding that for much longer periods of time. And then eventually you might go like, all right, you're 15 to 25 yards split. We're going to hold that for longer. And you can kind of keep on working that out where they're getting volume without kind of just all of a sudden go all out. And at the same time, you can work whatever technical aspects of that you want to. So I
Mm.
guess long the long way to ask this question is, how much of the time are you spent doing drill work versus letting them sprint? And I know like a sprint could be like the crescendo sprint, like you said, but I would say not necessarily giving a constraint like a stick over their head or something like that. How much drill work are you doing?
You mean like classic A skips, B skips, all that stuff?
I
Marches?
mean, drill could be anything. I would say anything where it's not a max effort sprint where you're having them focus on something. Run with
Mhm.
your arms crossed, run with the arms overhead, run with it on your back. Do what, yeah, it could be any
Mhm.
of those things.
So run with your arms crossed, run with your arms overhead, run with one arm. Those are all constraints, internal constraints.
Sure.
I do that a lot, right? So in terms of drills, something that so you're like what you mean is something that is not running, but is the intention is to improve some aspect of running, right?
I would call all of those things you just named different drills.
Okay. Um, yeah, so in terms of A skips, B skips, marches, I'll do some A skips and B skips in I don't really do B skips to be honest, or C skips. I do A skips in the warm up just to warm up the lower legs and maybe the hip flexors. I like to do like a karaoke where you throw your knee high, just to warm up that hip flexion, get some dynamic mobility. You want to call it that, but like I don't I can't really think of anything that is supposed to make you run better that is not running. Maybe I'll do
No,
like a
I should say it's like
straight
it
leg,
can be
like
running, but I would say it would be like sub max work. I should have said it like that.
mhm.
So any sort of sub max running.
I do it all the time. That's all I
Okay.
do basically.
Yeah.
That's so literally my speed session is get warm, however you want to do it. Okay. So obviously I always have like some type of warm up for the people, but
Yeah,
I start
sure.
with some plyometrics to warm up the lower legs. I dynamically stretch the hamstrings, that type of stuff. Maybe I'll do like straight leg skips, with like a band
Mm-hmm.
holding and a stick over it. If you want to call that a drill, I call it dynamic, like elastic, ballistic hamstring stretching and lower leg
Yeah.
prep. And then I just get into running, honestly, and I use constraints. So I use internal constraints and external constraints. So an external constraint would, for example, be something like wickets, running with a stick over your head, um, running with a band around your waist. Resisted running is a constraint, makes you have a lower center of mass, steeper shin angles, gets you to orient the force a little bit more horizontally into the ground. That will be external constraints. Something external is forcing you to run in a different way. Then you have internal constraints. Those will be run with your arms crossed, run with one arm. Don't let your knees come high. Run squatted, run hinged, run with your eyes focusing on one point. So things that you keep in mind that force you to run a certain way. And those are my sub-maximal running. Those are my warm-up sprints. I always warm up with some type of constrained running. So when I have an athlete, I look at how do they run and what is kind of missing. What could they improve on? Is it how they contact the ground? Is it their ground contact time? Is it their thigh separation? Is it their lumbopelvic stability? Is it their arm action? Is it the torsion of their spine? Is it yeah, those type of things. I just look at those, just look at how they are running, and I think to myself, okay, what constraint could I give them? What do they need to explore to run better? What are they missing? And then I'll give them a constraint and tell them, okay, so the first 40 meters, you're running like this. And then after 40 meters, release it and keep on running and feel what it gave you. That's it. And so the first sprint I would do is 30%, 40%, 50%. The more advanced, the lower I start. So first sprint, 50%. Second one, 60. Third one, 70. Then maybe 85, 90, and every single warm-up sprint is a constraint that is building my technique. And then once they're warm, boom, okay, let's send it. Let's run 100. This is what you got. This is like we're running 30-meter sprints today. You got 3 or 4 of them. Let's see. Let's see how when you will fall off. And then it's high quality sprints without thinking about anything, just run. And so I let all the technique work happens in the warm-up. I want them to get out of their own way, like Charlie Francis would say, in their maximal sprints. And if someone is saying, okay, today I am not feeling it, I'm feeling sluggish or anything like that, then I'll say, okay, then we're going to keep it submaximal today. We don't want to down program speed, especially with advanced athletes, fast athletes. They're a
Sure.
beginner, you could do it, but if someone is fast, some like above 9.6, 9.7 meters per second, for sure, don't sprint when they're not feeling it maximally.
So we talked about max speed sprinting. Let's talk about acceleration a little bit, and specifically rotation on the start. And I
Mm-hmm.
know I'm at my fastest when I get on the inside edges of my feet and I'm
Mm-hmm.
like driving through like my big toe and the ball of my big toe
Mm-hmm.
and feet going a little bit wider. So you get a little internal rotation when you do that. Um, I guess let's hear your thoughts on acceleration.
What exactly do you want to know? Like, what do you
All
mean?
right, first step, and I know like you talk about some rotation related to acceleration and rotation of like kind of the upper body
Mm-hmm.
as they go into it. Um, I guess why do you think that's important?
I think it's important to explore it. I don't think the fastest way to run is to run like a robot in a straight line and keep everything straight. Nobody does that. No, not a single fast person does that. So, for example, if you look at Xavier Worthy, the fastest NFL combines 40-yard dash ever, this guy is super rotational. And obviously it depends on your body structure. Are you more on the wide spectrum or more on the narrow spectrum with your skeletal structure? That will determine a lot of how much rotation you will leverage, how much spinal engine will you use, how much IR are you going to use in your hip flexion, and how wide your steps are going to be, how close your knees are going to be together when your thighs pass each other on the acceleration. So the wider a person is built, the more lateral space they're going to use in their acceleration, the more they're going to get their feet out, and the longer their feet are going to stay more outside of their hip in the acceleration. The more narrow someone and the less rotation they're going to use. The more narrow someone is, they if they're skilled accelerators, they will use wide steps at the beginning, but they will get narrow with their steps way more quickly. Their knees are going to come way closer to each other when they pass each other in the acceleration. And the more rotation they're going to use in their spine, the more lateral flexion, especially. So if someone has a certain level of skill in acceleration and they're accelerating and they're getting their feet wide, okay, like track sprinters or skilled 40-yard dash athletes, they're going to get their feet wide, but their shoulder is not matching the width of their foot. So if you look at like once they contact the floor, so let's say
Yeah.
someone runs, accelerates, their right foot hits the floor way outside of their hip, but their right shoulder is not in line with that right foot. Then you know, okay, he got potential to run with a little bit of a wider stride in the beginning. But if their spine is not matching the width and
I like that. Yeah.
they're leaving potential, they're leaving force production essentially and momentum that they can create on the table. So in that case, you want to allow them to explore more lateral flexion in their sprint.
Do you like David Weck talks a ton about like running with their head over foot.
Mm.
I guess I like that idea of the shoulder because you don't just want to like shift the upper body. You need to tilt the
And the
upper
frontal
body.
plane opens up the transverse plane.
Yeah.
The frontal plane is like that lateral flexion of the spine is what opens up this downward pulse that David Wex talks about with the shoulder, with the clavicle, with the shoulder blade. Those can only whip down into the ground and give you that, like Darren Barr calls it, the vertical input.
Yeah.
If you're flexing to that side to match your foot, if you don't do it, you're out of sync. Your timing is off. You're this
Inefficient.
exactly that like you're having the torsion, the torque generation in the upper body of momentum does not match what your lower body can do. Now, if you're over rotating, like if you're overly laterally flexing and your
Yeah.
shoulder is way outside of your foot, haven't seen that, but you don't want that as well, right? And you also don't want to stay in that lateral flexion for too long. So if your right foot hits and your right shoulder is right over in line with your right foot, but you're getting to toe off and you've toed off, but your right shoulder hasn't moved to the other side yet, then you are losing time. Then it's
Yeah.
inefficiency. So as your right foot toes off, your right shoulder needs also to move to the other side so that you can get into the other foot.
Well, it's
That
funny,
is the
like thinking
timing of
about
things.
this and relating it to even like any sort of multi-directional drill. One of the big keys to changing direction faster is getting your trunk rotated the new direction of travel. And excessive lateral flexion, someone slamming on the brakes, that's no good. But at high speeds, you see it, but you just don't want it to go into excess.
Mhm.
But you're right about like when that happens, even if we're going just sprinting straight ahead, we still basically need the trunk to rotate the new direction just to the other foot and then go back and forth like that. Kind of just like all that stuff just kind of goes together.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's we don't move forward in a straight line. It's like I don't want to quote Bill Hartman on this. Like we move in spirals. Like we move in helixes. Like we don't just like go translate forward. We rotate forward. Like people want to talk about every movement is rotation. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. You rotate you twist your way forward, and the more narrow you are, the more bouncy you are, the more elastically gifted you are, the more you're gonna leverage that twisting rotation forward. If you're like a defensive a lineman in football is not going to use that same rotation as, for example, a Noah Lyles will or a Usain Bolt will. You know,
No.
if you
Yeah.
compare a Christian Coleman to a Usain Bolt, different body structures, or a Safa Powell to Usain Bolt. Usain Bolt is like a narrow stick, bouncy narrow stick. He's gonna use way more IR on a internal rotation on his swing leg in the hip flexion than Safa Powell will. It's a little bit more sturdy. Or better example, Su Bingtian, the Chinese sprinter.
Yeah.
A
The
little bit
top
more,
60 guy. Yeah.
yes, a little bit more sturdier build, you know, doesn't use quite the same rotation as someone
He
who
can
is more.
accelerate, but then
Yes.
yeah, you're right. Then just kind of like slowly, kind of. I don't want to say slow because he's still running sub 10 seconds, but
Yeah.
yeah, in comparison to his acceleration, it is not quite as good.
You
Um,
could also like one more example, like just look at Xavier Worthy from the front view, super rotation. Like it can't nobody can tell me that rotating is inefficient and a waste of movement. Look at Xavier Worthy from the front view, like in the NFL combat. Like I even posted a breakdown of it. Like Xavier Worthy, super rotational, and then look at someone like Tyreek Hill from the front view. Tyreek Hill a little bit more sturdier, wider built, doesn't use the same rotation as like Xavier Worthy.
I heard I about like geez 5 years ago now. I went to Lee Taft's speed retreat at his
Mhm.
house, so just a weekend long thing. But Bill Hartman came to speak at it, which was like
Mhm.
really interesting. And it's funny, like he's like, all right, there's like 5 or 6 people there. He's like, everybody ask me a question, anything you want. And people ask rehab related, performance related. He's like, everybody's asking me the same exact question. But then he went into talking about like the ability to rotate and things like that. And the thing that kind of stuck with me was he's like, if you watch a figure skater when they go into any sort of spin, when they're just like spinning on the ice, they bring their hands in and they speed up real fast. And then when they take their hands back out, they slow down. And the wider they are, the slower they are. And then he did talk about like an offensive lineman in football, and basically like you want to resist rotation in that position where if someone pushes your shoulder, you want to be wide just for the sake of someone not being able to rotate you. And I was just thinking,
Exactly.
geez, all these guys, they should just be doing like pull downs all day long, just have like the biggest lats of all time.
Yeah, that could and shoulders as well.
Yeah,
Like wide ass delts. Like if you got cannonball delts, then your rotation is gonna come with more inertia. So it's biomechanics. It's like the structure will dictate the function. And again, like I'm not saying everybody should rotate to the max. Like people always want to take like some statement and like and just dispute the absolute extreme of it. Nobody's talking about everybody has to rotate maximally. I'm just saying
yeah,
explore your rotation. Just see what it is, see how it is for yourself to rotate a lot and then rotate little. Like you can also do like a contrast, like so one time you explore super crazy rotation and then the next set you do error amplification. Like you try to run super stiff. And then after in the third sprint, you just let go and you just run. And your body will do whatever it deems the best for itself. The brain is smart. Self-organization works. You just have to know how to elicit it the right way to use it to your advantage. And then you don't have to say
absolutely.
a word. I'm not telling people to step wider. I'm not telling people to rotate more. I just tell them, do this with the stick before you run and then see what happens.
I do want to ask you one more question before I let you go.
Sure.
You work with David Gray a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, so I just want to kind of hear about that experience because I mean, anybody who has followed David Gray's stuff, particularly like watching any sort of stuff he does with like the leg, the lower leg, and
Mhm.
he like how he combines rehab and just how he looks at things is a very, very smart guy. So I guess like what do you learn from that experience of someone like that kind of looking at how you move, having you do different things, and then kind of going on? I guess, did you learn anything that you didn't already think about, like your rehab from, and I know it was like a while ago from your ACL injury. But yeah,
Man, at this point, shout out David Gray. Like he's the rehab goat to me. And yeah, I learned a ton from him. Like insane, like how much I learned from him. Um, Basically, the biggest takeaway I would say, biggest two takeaways is first of all, how you do movement matters. Like a little, like a couple cent, like a millimeter difference in some type of movement. Like if your sit bone is here versus is here, makes a huge difference in how your muscles will be loaded. So how you do movement matters a lot. How you perform your squat, how you perform your split squat, how you perform your hinge, it matters. And you have to learn what what is a quote unquote good hinge, good squat. What does it encompass? Like how are the joints moving in relation to each other in order to load your structures the right way, the or to properly disperse the load between the structures that make up the joint. So my coaching eye improved like crazy from learning by learning from him. Second thing is like your exercises don't change. That was the second big takeaway message from him. Like your exercises never change. Not never change, but your exercises don't need to change. Most of what you see David do on the gram, he does that with basic like with most of his guys. But the what changes is how he coaches those things, how you
Yeah.
coach those. So, for example, if I'm trying to improve the foot pronation of a person, then the drill doesn't change. The drill is the pronation drill that David Gray teaches. So I think, for example, the way he teaches it is a lot better than how Gary Ward teaches it. So I've done the whole Gary Ward thing, and it didn't get me the same results as David's stuff. And the reason why is it was the same movement, but the coaching was different. The cueing was
Yeah.
different. And that differs from person to person because why one person won't pronate is totally different from why another person won't pronate. Like one person will maybe always grip their toes, and the other person will always try to pull their shin forward with their tibialis anterior. So you need to uncue those things to allow for the pronation to happen, for example, right? So how you coach things and how you do movements matters a lot. And being reductionistic about how a squat is performed, how a deadlift is performed, may work for Gen Pop, may work for people who want average results. But if you want to especially work in high level pro sports where you cannot mess up under no circumstance, then you have to be super super detailed with what you do, especially if the res if a 1% change can can have a huge impact. Like
Yeah.
for the average weekend warrior, doesn't matter if they have maximum relative motion at their knee or like they have a perfect hinge and they have those 3 or 4 degrees of internal rotation more. But for a $1 million athlete, it does make a huge difference because if maybe they lacking a little bit of foot pronation, then because the way you squat them, because the exercises that you choose for them aren't the right ones for them, their hips get a little bit tighter, so they lose a little bit of internal rotation as well. And then so they lack a little bit of pronation at the foot that you cannot teach them how to do it. And because of your bad exercise selection, they lost a little bit of internal rotation at their hip. So now you have a leg that is worse at internally rotating. And if you lack the foot pronation and the hip internal rotation, your body's going to have to find the internal rotation somewhere else, which is the knee. And then you create stress on the medial knee joint, and then it's your fault because you didn't know how to solve the issue of their foot, and you didn't know what exercises to select. You didn't know how to coach the exercise to improve the hip IR potentially, or at least not make it worse. And then after 6, 12 months, 18 months, maybe 2 years, 3 years, the athlete picks up some overuse injury to the medial side of the knee joint, and nobody's going to think it was a strength coach, but actually you did that shit over the long term. And maybe this is like a little bit of an extreme example, but the little mini percents matter in pro sports. And that is what I learned from David Gray.
That's awesome. I always appreciate people that the attention to detail is just so high. And like you said, the drills are simple, the exercises are simple. Like anybody could cue the exercises, but the person that cues it to get you where you need to go, that's the guy. That's
That
the
is the
one.
guy. That is the
Yeah,
difference. You can
it
steal the
really is.
sauce, but the
Yeah.
meal won't taste the same if you don't know
Yep.
how to whip it up. Um, yeah, so like you mentioned, like the details matter. Details matter. Like, for example, shout out to Terry's Hightower. Um, he said, why do you, he said that like a while ago, he said that. So he said, why do people talk about hamstring rehab? Why does nobody talk about semimembranosis rehab?
Mm.
Right?
Yeah,
Like
people just say
details
general
matter.
hamstring
People,
rehab. Yeah.
yeah, and like I really dislike this whole trend of being reductionistic about training and saying, oh, just sprint, lift, and throw, and you'll get more athletic. Oh, just lift with intent, just train hard. I hate that approach. That approach works for a certain population, but if you want to be elite, if you don't want to create results and positive change, if you want to create transformations, then that stuff matters. That stuff
It
absolutely
does.
matters. And I have a great case study on YouTube of where this stuff absolutely changed the guy's athleticism. Like within 1 month,
Yeah.
I put 4 inches on his vertical. 4 inches within 1 month, tested on the force plate before and after, because we did so much stuff. We unlocked his plantar flexion. We improved his hip extension, the split squat. We improved his knee relative motion and did the plyos and targeted specific qualities that we identified in the counter movement jump. And it changed his athleticism. And I'm sure if I just made him lift hard, if I didn't spend the extra, let's say 2 or 3 hours before the workout, during the warm up, doing like what you would call physio stuff, quote unquote. If I
Yeah.
didn't do that, then and I just lifted hard and let him do plyos and sprint, I don't think that transformation would have happened. And I also don't like the oh yeah, sprint mechanics is overrated for team sport athletes. It's not.
No.
It's really not.
Yeah.
Sprinting is important. The way how you sprint determines how you run. It's important. And when people discredit it and say, "Oh, you don't need to worry about that. You just let him sprint hard." Yes, that's exactly what you're supposed to do. But if you just sprinkle in some constraints before you let them sprint hard, then that will influence their speed technique. And I have tons of videos of before and after. Just like I never told a basketball player how to run. I just let them do some constraints, and their sprint technique changed because I used the right constraints that was limiting him specifically. And
Yeah. I have a
yeah.
WNBA player right now,
Mhm.
and she's really good pushing off of her right foot, go in any direction. And the left foot, it's there there is power there, but the coordination doing certain movements and types of things, like, all right, let's just perform this drill on this direction, perform it primarily pushing off the left foot going the other direction. It's just not there. And I'm thinking, all right, this person has put in literally thousands of hours playing. So without actually like teaching this movement, that would not really get better on its own. Like it's maxed out, but it is looking at those little things, especially like the higher the level athlete. You need to learn those little things that you can actually make a difference in. Where it's like, all right, you're in this position. Now I'm going to give you, instead of like two options to create a shot, I'm going to give you like four options to create a shot, because now you can push off of both legs doing different things like that. Um, so yeah, but technique matters. Doesn't matter what it is. The technique does matter
It
big time.
matters. It matters big time, and that's what differentiates the elites from the sub elites. It's like how they move, how they perform
Yeah.
movements. Like yeah, like what you just mentioned with the WNBA player. Like what you said, you give them four options instead of two. Exactly, constraint based learning. You don't tell them what to do. You just give them more options, and they're gonna figure out. If you never create the environment for an athlete to explore new options of movement, they will always, especially under stress, revert to their old movement library. You need to
Yes.
expand that movement library. And whether that is learning how to get their like her left foot, learning how to get her left foot better outside of her center of mass before she initiates an acceleration, or whether that is creating better, more hip abduction at that left femur to allow her in the first place to get her foot wider in the in that acceleration. All those things matter, and it's the attention to detail that differentiates good training from great training. And yeah, I just don't buy the whole reductionistic approach. I just don't buy it. I just don't think it is that easy. And it's really not, because I did the reduction. I did the, oh, just sprint with intent. Oh, just run. That is exactly where the hamstring injuries occur. If you just let someone sprint, and then and obviously they have some hole in their sprint pattern because they never learned how to sprint because they were just playing a team sport, which is not to blame on them. This is how shit works, right? Like if you don't never get specific sprint training, then you probably don't know how to sprint, you know? And I think that that is just a disservice to the athlete if you don't pay attention to the details, because they are only paying you for that 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever, and you want to get on with it, and you have to make sure they do their plyos, and you don't want to over deliver, or you don't want to sit down at night or in the early morning and read and study. Yeah, you can choose whatever road you want to choose. You can choose the reductionistic road path, or you can choose the nuanced path. And just because you choose the nuanced path, it doesn't mean that you now completely take every movement and to the last detail. No, like it's always finding a balance. It's not going to one extreme and then marrying that extreme and saying, "Oh, I always do everything I do is super detailed and super crazy biomechanical details must be met." No, it's if something applies, you're going to use it. If it doesn't, you're just going to let them move. And most importantly, you don't tell them how to move. You just create the environment that allows them to move in various ways to find better and more movement solutions.
Well said. It's a good spot to end.
Thank
Tell
you.
everybody where they can find you if they don't already follow you.
Mostly Saisan training, so Saisan training on Instagram and YouTube. So those are my main pages, and yeah, you can find
You have a
everything on
course.
there.
Tell people about your course.
Yeah, so we talked about it today. I released the late knee extension course, and basically I tell you how to get a proper hip extension in your lifting, how to get a good improved hip extension in your sprints as well. That is my whole exercise system. So everything we talked about today with the hip extension, anterior tilt, hip flexion, all that stuff, it's all in the course, step by step exercise system for you to implement it with yourself and your athletes. And yeah,
And with this guy, you will get the attention to detail, which is
yes,
awesome.
sir. No reductionistic shit.
All
We need the
right.
biomechanics to be exact.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Dario.
Thanks for having me, Jason.